Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. I first want to start off by apologizing for any technical issues that may have arisen from yesterday's stream. I got a couple of comments talking about sometimes cutting in and out. Just know, on my end of things, I have done everything I can to potentially solve that issue. But if something like this happens again, please let me know in the comments, and I will try to mitigate for that and continue trying to solve, at least on my end of things, whatever issue might be happening. But we cannot dwell in the past too much. Let us focus on today's show. It should be an exciting show. A grab bag of fantasy topics for you guys. Starting off with my bold fantasy predictions for Week 2 of the NFL season, as Week 1 has officially concluded. Then we look to the waiver wire, and then I give you some early season trade advice. And last but not least, we finish out with some updated QB rankings. This is not necessarily my rankings. I will focus on those later in the week, but just rankings assessing the quarterback and running back play from this week. But before we begin with any of that, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Everything you do for the network, and especially for me and my fellow podcasters, is greatly appreciated. Also, continue making yourselves available. You've been doing an excellent job of this. I love the interaction that this show has been receiving. Super chat, super thanks, and super stickers features on YouTube to contribute to the show. They're great ways to contribute to the show, great ways to support the network, especially me and my fellow podcasters yet again. But without further ado, let us jump right into today's show. Let's start off in the world of bold fantasy predictions. After 1 week of the NFL season, we have now seen every single team. We have now seen their flaws, their strengths, their weaknesses. Some players potentially can be breakout stars, some players who are still strutting their stuff at the NFL level. But at the end of the day, I thought it was going to be interesting to kind of give some bold fantasy predictions for this upcoming season. And so I think that at the end of the day, what I wanted to do was kind of make some not necessarily outlandish kind of proclamations here, but also ones that I feel as if are kind of going to make sense in the future. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into today's bold fantasy predictions with our first segment. Let's start off with a fantasy prediction that kind of will make sense if this team gets it together next week, and I think they will. And this guy especially is someone who I was very non-committal about last night. And so without further ado, let's talk about Aaron Rodgers. My bold prediction for him is that he eventually will be a top 10 fantasy QB this week. Now, about his performance last night, like I said, I'm kind of non-committal about this performance from him. Because while he wasn't overly bad, he wasn't overly good as well. But there are ways in which I feel as if he wasn't to blame. I was actually surprised by the offensive line's performance in this game. And I was also kind of surprised that Breece Hall did not play a big part. It was all kind of Aaron Rodgers running this offense. And so I kind of feel like as they play the Titans next week, I think that they will see some improvements along this line here, and as well as incorporating more people into this offense. I think that Aaron Rodgers, at the end of the day, still proved that he has something in him. Of course, it all depends on whether this offensive line can sustain that stability that they have, but it all comes down to, the improvement overall this team. Now, next week, I'm looking at the Tennessee Titans defense, and it certainly profiles as one that's going to be potent in the running game. They have big guys up front like Devondre Sweat, like Arden Key, like Sebastian Joseph Day, who can wreak havoc. So perhaps they're not going to emphasize the run game as much, and that might see Aaron Rodgers get more opportunities to strut his stuff vertically and get more opportunities down the field. So I want to see the Jets constantly improve, and show their growth throughout the season, and will start this next game. So that's my first bold prediction of the day about Aaron Rodgers being a potential top 10 fantasy QB for this week. My second prediction, not quite as bold as these two quarterbacks. Whenever they face each other, I believe bring out the best in each other. It's going to be a classic Thursday night game in the division. Actually, let me get back to the first one before, because this first one is kind of controversial as well, depending on how you viewed this running back's performance this week. But Derrick Henry to continue his quote-unquote rough start. Now, I say rough start relatively because a lot of people could view Derrick Henry's performance against the Chiefs as a solid start for him in Baltimore. He obviously got a lot of touches on that first drive as they established the run game early, but later in the game, whether it be game flow or them just wanting Lamar to get more comfortable, they went away from the rushing attack. And so I feel like, as someone who does not see this fit very well in Baltimore, what with, their kind of committee approach in the past, I still think that Derrick Henry will have a rough going of it. They're going to go against the Raiders, and the Raiders, much like the Titans, have a very solid front. Max Crosby and Malcolm Koonce are solid eds. They add Christian Wilkins, and they're not necessarily, going to want to give up as much run plays as they were gashed on the ground this week against the Chargers. So look for Derrick Henry to not contribute as much. And also, they did feel more comfortable having Justice Hill on the field as kind of a security blanket for this offense. And so going forward, I want to see how this team can incorporate Derrick Henry in ways that make him feel comfortable. But right now, I just don't see it. Getting back to my third kind of fantasy prediction of the day here. These two guys always play each other tough. Interdivisional game. Tua and Josh Allen to both have the best fantasy performances of the week. No particular order. They'll both be 1-2. Doesn't matter who. Now, the reason why I say this is because what we saw from both of these teams was that with the Dolphins, they struggled early on offense. They didn't really get anything going. Tua wasn't necessarily settled. And then the second half, they really got going after that Tyreek Hill long touchdown. And they were able to grind it out against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And quietly, I believe Tua had the most passing yards of any quarterback this week with 338 passing yards. He only did have that one touchdown to Tyreek Hill. But at the end of the day, that just goes to show that he still has all these weapons. They're not going anywhere. And if he can just be accurate enough to get them the football, then this offense is going to be one of the most explosive in the NFL. On the other side of things, while, yes, I take more of the wide receiver performance away from this, as 8 different wide receivers caught passes from Josh Allen, I'm looking at Josh Allen as the center point of this offense still. And whereas before it was kind of seen in a negative perspective, I kind of see it now more positively as this offense is going to improve week by week. Now, obviously, there's concerns about that hand-wrist injury that he suffered on his second rushing touchdown in that game. But I still think that at the end of the day, the bottom line is he's going to do what he can to get this team going. And in terms of the profile of both of these defenses, I think that the Dolphins' defense, while they have the players, it's all about them, A, staying healthy, and B, playing in a connected manner. They were able to pull out the win, keep Jacksonville at 17 points. Great play by Javon Holland to punch the ball out on Travis Etienne. They made some fantastic plays on defense, but at the end of the day, I want to see this sustained. Whereas the Bills, they lost a lot. They lose nickel corner to Ron Johnson. They're going to have to call up a lot of rookies from the practice squad, and Cole Bishop and Daquan Hardy to kind of continue that rotation. But in their solid starters, in Christian Benford and Rasul Douglas, they still have guys who can play out there. But I definitely think this is going to be a track meet of a game. So look for both of these guys to have fantastic fantasy performances. I'll be looking at this game because I decided to start Tua over Brock Purdy after last night's performance from Brock. So it's definitely a game to watch. Now, this final prediction is definitely my most outlandish of all. I wrote this prediction before I had seen these games, kind of thinking that this game might be more even than people think, but it does kind of seem a little bit more outlandish after the fact. But I'm still sticking with it because who knows? This could potentially happen, but just know that this is definitely a prediction that is definitely out of the blue. Many people will be skeptical about it, but I'm sticking by it. And that is Caleb Williams to outperform CJ Stroud in terms of fantasy production in their game this Sunday. Now, I know what you're thinking. Caleb did not look great against Tennessee. He looked overmatched. He kind of missed several routes. He did not have any true connection with any one of his three top receivers. But in this game, the reason why I kind of took this prediction as a shot in the dark was that Caleb has this ability to, on any given moment, raise his level based off his leadership. He already set a foundation in camp. And when I look at both of these defenses, right, the Chicago Bears defense definitely profiles as the weaker one in this matchup, but they still have a lot of talent. I mean, Tyreek Stevenson had a pick six. Kyler Gordon's a great quarter. Definitely looked over. Jalen Johnson, a Pro Bowler last year. Whereas I look at the Texans as well, they definitely have a lot of strength on defense. They added Danielle Hunter this past offseason. They have guys in their secondary who are like Derek Stingley Jr., Dalen Pichu will continue to grow in the system as D'Amico Ryans gives them this culture and identity that you can't deny. But I don't necessarily think it will be wild to see Caleb more comfortable in a second start. As we talked about before, rookie quarterbacks in their first starts are not as successful. But some legends also weren't successful, like John Elway, for example, one of the last quarterbacks to get a win in his rookie season. 1 of 8 for 14 yards and an interception in his first game. So it's not outlandish to think that Caleb Williams will improve. Maybe it's outlandish to see so much drastic improvement in only his second game playing in the NFL. But I can see a world where the Bears drag them into this game. Maybe they go to the run game a little bit more, try and get Swift involved. And it opens up more for Caleb, where he's not, having to work out of structure. It's going to rely upon a fantastic game from the offensive line up front, and it's going to rely on DeAndre Swift stepping up. But I think it could happen. I'm not saying it will, but remember, I said these are bold fantasy predictions. So take them all with a grain of salt. I truly will stand by them, but these are predictions that you are welcome to be skeptical about. Let me know what you think in the comments, but that will just about do it for our first segment here on today's show. Coming next, we take a look around the waiver wire. Guys who you should pick up or drop. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about the waiver wire.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment here of today's show, I want to remind you again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link GSMC Podcast.net. But also, since we are now a live show, as we get a comment from Shep Easy Sweet Spot alluding to my last segment, Caleb's a bit of a project, going to be a lot of bumps in his road. I agree with you. And that's why I said that this prediction that I was making was very outlandish. But I can see a world where in this game, if they can get the run game going, which was a problem in their game against Tennessee last week, there's definitely a chance for Caleb to not feel so much pressure to create. Because that's where I feel like the NFL is different from college football. In college football, you can improvise so much more. In the NFL, you certainly can improvise, but there has to be some structure to it. In this game, we can definitely see Caleb start to transition there and learn from his mistakes that he made in the Titans game. But I do want to remind you before we get into our second segment about the waiver wire that, as Captain Joking says, huge fan of the show. Thank you so much, Captain Joking. If you are new, welcome to the show. Already a sub. Trade question. Should I trade Adams? I believe he's talking about Devontae Adams and Jordan Mason for Rashee Rice. Let me tell you a story about Rashee Rice. I left him on my bench. Definitely regretted leaving him on my bench. Big game for him. I think he's very effective in this Chiefs offense as that wide receiver one. Proved that he could be a wide receiver one in this Chiefs offense. But then again, you think about all the weapons they have now. Xavier Worthy, even though he only had 3 targets, made the most of them. Marquise Hollywood-Brown didn't even play. Travis Kelce still there. Juju maybe. So the Chiefs offense is just so weird in terms of fantasy to kind of diagnose that I just think that at this current point in time, while I love Rashee Rice, I can't see this continuing where it's a point that you should rely on him as a wide receiver one in fantasy. Whereas Devontae Adams, yes, there's frustration in that Las Vegas Raiders offense, and Gardner Minshew's not someone who you can see getting him the ball. But Jordan Mason's an interesting piece. We'll talk about him a little bit in this segment. Jordan Mason could add a lot of value in terms of a trade. So I don't necessarily like this whole trade, but say in a couple weeks, if we talk about Jordan Mason a little bit more where he has a supplementary role to Christian McCaffrey that allows him to get a lot of touches in that San Fran offense, then you can make something. At this current point, I would sit tight a little bit because I like Rashee Rice. I like what he brings. But Jordan Mason is someone who can have a lot of leverage in the future for trades. You can get a lot more for Jordan Mason if you wait just a little bit. So I think that this trade has some interest to it and some weight to it that's very exciting. But at this current point, it's not, a trade that I would make at this moment. But let's get into some waiver wire additions that could potentially help your team as well. Already having Jordan Mason, Captain Joe King, is a huge help to you. I wasn't necessarily going to talk about this guy going off this week because I actually thought Christian McCaffrey was going to start this game. Then we got breaking news a couple minutes before the game that he was going to be out. So it's like, that's a big concern for fantasy football fans. But let's see what this San Francisco offense is all about. I had Brock Purdy in my team. I thought this meant that maybe the passing game would open a little bit more. It did not. I lost my first fantasy game because of that. But I was shocked that they had another game plan where Brock Purdy wasn't this distributor in this offense. Jordan Mason really stepped up to the plate. And that's why he's an intriguing asset in terms of whether you still have him on your team or he's still on the waiver wire in your league because of the leverage he presents. As Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, I'm first in waivers for my league and Baker's available. My QBs are Stroud and Herbert. Is there a better pick than Baker? I think that, yes, you can afford to drop one of your QBs. Perhaps Justin Herbert would be the better option to drop, and you definitely can pick up Baker Mayfield. Baker is a guy who I was going to talk about, but at the end of the day, he's going to be someone who is going to be a week-by-week kind of guy. I love Baker, but he still has that tendency to have a streaky game in him where, he's not up to par. But big win for him against Washington in Liam Cohen's offense. That was the question. How will the loss of Dave Canales affect Baker Mayfield? Because it definitely affected Geno Smith in Seattle a little bit. But he looked sterling in this game. Liam Cohen definitely carrying over a lot of the traits that make Baker Mayfield special in this offense, and I really like how he profiles. Perhaps in deeper leagues he makes a lot of sense, in 2 QB leagues maybe as well, but I wouldn't necessarily call him a starter at this point. He is definitely one of the most contentious fantasy QBs out there, and he still adds a lot of value should you decide to take a swing for him, whether it be through waivers or just by streaming him week by week. But let's get back to Jordan Mason. Let's get back to Captain Joe King's comment, because whether he is on your team, whether you were attuned to him and knew about, Christian McCaffrey's injuries and decided to take a flyer on him and drafted him, or he was still on your waiver wires, Jordan Mason becomes an interesting leverage piece. I talked about this a little bit. Not necessarily a similar situation, but the whole Jonathan Brooks, Chuba Hubbard thing, where you could use Chuba Hubbard early as leverage, where you can draft him and trade him away and promote Jonathan Brooks to your RB1, or you could just keep Chuba Hubbard, and if he plays very well in the Panthers offense, and we saw what happened with that Panthers offense, then, things could happen. But Jordan Mason is definitely an interesting proposition, because they didn't even update us on the extent of the Christian McCaffrey injury, so who knows if he will play this weekend against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, I don't necessarily think that he will be as good as, say, a guy like Chuba Hubbard, even though that sounds kind of funny because of the strengths of the 49ers offense, but it was very telling that they really relied upon him in this game, because I did not expect a backup running back to have that much success in this offense. Yeah, it just goes to show a Kyle Shanahan offense is just so versatile in what it can do. So look out for Jordan Mason if he sticks around, and if Kyle Shanahan has plans for him, even if and when Christian McCaffrey comes back. Let's get back to the quarterback situation, because this weekend there were a lot of quarterbacks who had a point to prove, and one of them may not even have been on your radar as a fantasy QB. He's lost his luster as a fantasy QB as he moved from Las Vegas to New Orleans, but maybe something is brewing with this guy. So, even though he has a very tough matchup this weekend against the Cowboys defense, who looked fantastic against the Browns, albeit a Browns team who I'm not expecting much of on offense, Derek Carr certainly looked like an intriguing fantasy option. And when I look at this Saints offense, it's not as bleak as I thought it was going to be. Alvin Kamara still proved that he can provide some level of production. Rashid Shaheed, a very intriguing deep threat for him. And so this Saints offense could sneak up on a lot of people. They could be a sneaky team even in the NFC South, which now looks more wide open because Atlanta does not look as good as people thought they were going to be. And yes, they're still going to be Tampa Bay, but the NFC South with those divisional games, you never know. So see if you can stream Derek Carr. I still don't rely upon him as a competent fantasy QB. But that game, yes, it was against the Panthers, but it did show what the best of the New Orleans Saints offense could look like, and there's certainly pieces there that I'm more confident in. As Tap to Learn says, I can see Shanahan taking the burden off McCaffrey this year. Mason may get a decent slice of that pie, at least early in the season. I could see a world where that's the case, because it definitely looked like it against the New York Jets. You definitely, even if you're Kyle Shanahan, could not have had that much confidence in Jordan Mason going into this game. And yet, that's exactly what the game plan was. I was shocked, guys. I was shocked that was the 49ers game plan, to grind it on the ground with a former undrafted free agent. And yet, Kyle Shanahan was able to do that because he's Kyle Shanahan and because there's so much confidence in this team. No matter who you are, you have the opportunity to step up. And so that's a fantastic point. McCaffrey is definitely someone who, yes, is he a fantastic, fascinating fantasy asset? Absolutely. But he does come with that injury history, so you have to be wary of that. Jordan Mason, whether you're privy to him or not, is someone that you definitely should look out for. But then let's get to the wide receivers. This is where it gets interesting. And let's talk about the play of Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce was someone who was seen as either a wide receiver 3 or as an intriguing outside receiver for the Indianapolis Colts and for Anthony Richardson. But in a similar fashion, not exactly a similar fashion to Xavier Worthy because they had very different games. On 3 catches, he had 125 yards and proved to be a receiver that Anthony Richardson felt like he could trust. Now, Anthony Richardson had one of the most impressive throws I've ever seen in my life, and he's going to continue to develop that arm talent. So the question is, if the Colts feel like they have opportunities downfield, who will be the deep threat? Because remember, A.D. Mitchell is still there. They drafted him, and they have big expectations for him. And Anthony Richardson did overthrow him on some plays in that game. So, Alec Pierce definitely is someone to keep your eye on. Maybe we'll have to wait it out in terms of the waiver wire. I wouldn't immediately go out for him because I want to see more of the Colts, especially Anthony Richardson, if he can sustain that level of downfield passing that we saw glimpses of in that game. But Alec Pierce, man, who would have thought that he would be the Colts' leading receiver? I definitely thought that Michael Pittman would have a better year. Yes, he had some games where he wasn't necessarily profiling as a wide receiver 1, but that was with Minshew, so we'll definitely see. But at the end of the day, it's always good for a rookie, what feels like a rookie quarterback because he didn't have game time last year, but for a second-year quarterback coming off an injury, to have a guy who can rely upon, and most importantly, be a guy you can rely upon because it taps into one of his strengths, which is downfield passing. So Alec Pierce is interesting. Finally, let's talk about Jordan Love before we go to a quick break. Because the situation surrounding Jordan Love is the Packers believe that his timeline to return will be shorter than expected. But there's definitely QBs on the market. Even Malik Willis that I think could be profiled. Let's talk about Malik Willis. Yes, he had his struggles with the Titans, but the Packers are certainly a team where, he can have decent games. Yes, their schedule's looking rough, but this game against the Colts could be a very exciting game where Malik Willis can perform out of structure. This receiving group, yes, it doesn't have a wide receiver 1, which might make a backup more comfortable to have a security blanket kind of guy, but that's its strength as well. You have so much variety that you can find a solid receiver that you like. So maybe Malik Willis can profile as someone in a deeper league. I'm not saying you should go out and get him immediately, but he could profile as someone who you might be taking a flyer on. And going back to the point of Love, I don't want to say that you should drop him, but I don't necessarily feel confident in the truth of what the Packers are saying. Because MCL sprains, or what happened to Jordan Love, definitely take a little time to wait out. So we're going to have to wait and see with that. But that's all the updates on the waiver wire. Definitely an exciting time early in the season. Don't want to be too premature with your waiver wire pickups. Definitely try and wait it out, but I'm just letting you know. Let me know what you think about my waiver wire kind of updates in the comments, but that will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, I'll give you some early season trade advice, which positions you should be looking at, and which players you could be looking at. We'll be right back after the break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. just like on your favorite cable sports channel. Except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our first two segments. We're going to continue with this narrative of looking at fantasy before we get into the meat of our episode, which is our updated rankings after Week 1. But I just wanted to take a third segment where I want to look into some trade advice, because a lot of people, and we've gotten a lot of comments in prior shows talking about trade advice and what to do in certain situations. And I want to definitely look back at some of the more intriguing trades that we got. I want to go back to Captain Joe King's comment here, because it's an interesting comment, and it definitely shows the level of depth you have to understand in terms of a trade. Because there are different markets that can be traded differently, and there are different values and situations that can be covered over others. So say, for instance, looking at Captain Joe King's. He wanted to trade away Adams and Jordan Mason in return for Rashee Rice. This is an interesting trade because like-for-like trades are much more easier to assess. But the reason why, as Shapisi Sweet Spot says, Jefferson and Aaron Jones for Tyreek and Achane, that's another example of an interesting trade, because you're getting like-for-like trades where you can assess both positions. Whereas if you're just looking for a 2-for-1 deal or a 3-for-1 deal this early in the season, that's where I might warn you. But situations where you're getting 2-for-2 and 2-for-1, and it's a high-value player that you get in return, are easier to assess, because the markets are going to become more volatile as we get more injury updates, especially as more players become available on the waiver wire. It's going to be interesting to assess trades. But let's start off with Shep Easy's Sweet Spots trade, because it's a very interesting and in-depth trade as well. 2-for-2 trade here. Jefferson and Aaron Jones for Tyreek and Achane. Now, what I like about this trade as well is that it's a 2-for-2 trade, but both of these players are on the same team. And that becomes very interesting. How do you value teams in this? When I look at Jefferson and Aaron Jones, they had nice games this week, but it was against a very easy defense. And the profile of the Minnesota Vikings offense is not as hopeful and optimistic as that of the Miami Dolphins, where Tyreek and Achane really have more opportunities. Tyreek and Achane didn't necessarily have a good game as a rusher, but he did have a good game as a receiver. I'll give him that. He's someone who I've always said we have to wait and see how the season will pan out for him. And then Tyreek Hill is someone who I think can just change the narrative of a game on one catch like he did in that game against Jacksonville. So assessing this trade is much easier when you know that the teams you're assessing are definitely more optimistic than one another. And that's what I see in this trade. I don't necessarily just see Jefferson and Aaron Jones. I see the Minnesota Vikings. And right now, as much as I love both of these players, and potentially more than, say, Achane, who could be seen as a liability in this trade, I think that this trade shouldn't necessarily happen. Yes, Tyreek Hill is a game-changing receiver. But at the end of the day, call me crazy, but Jefferson and Aaron Jones can elevate this Vikings offense and make it better. And that's another thing. The potential of what a certain offense with certain players can be. Because I like the Miami Dolphins as a team, but not necessarily as a team that has a lot of value in fantasy, because there are a lot of mouths to feed. Sam Darnold, meanwhile, can pick and choose which receiver or running back he wants to utilize the most, because he's growing into this offense, and this offense has room to grow. Yes, they're going to have a lot of tough games, and they're having a tough stretch right now, but Jefferson and Aaron Jones just add more value to their team, and in this trade, the Tyreek and Achane, because I'm not sure Achane will, really maintain the success that we saw last year throughout an entire year yet again. So that's a very good trade, very interesting trade, as Shep Easy Sweet, but also says, still curious about Adams and Mason for Rice. Do it. I did believe I said when I was addressing Captain Joe King's comment not to do it because Jordan Mason has a lot of leverage in this situation because of the up-in-the-air status of Christian McCaffrey. If, there wasn't so much tension and rumor surrounding the absence of Christian McCaffrey, I would have said to do it because I love Rashee Rice. I believe he can be a fantasy wide receiver 1 or 2. But at this current moment, Jordan Mason can be someone who adds a lot of leverage in the future. And you can fleece someone with Jordan Mason, especially if you're looking at the potentiality of certain markets as well. Because I think what we're going to see in the trade market this year is that a lot of people will be desperate for wide receivers a lot more, which you can take with a grain of salt, definitely. But I think that wide receivers are definitely going to be more coveted as the season goes on because of the volatility of certain NFL offense. Look at Devontae Adams, for example. He's not necessarily in the best situation in an offense. Look at Garrett Wilson. He's not in the best situation. So wide receivers are definitely a market to be wary of because if you're trying to propose a trade, if you're trying to take initiative with a trade, and you want to trade away guys who are high-profile receivers but might not fit in their offenses in real life, then that's a dangerous proposition. However, if someone is asking for a trade, if someone feels like they can add value through, say, a Devontae Adams or a Garrett Wilson, then that's a kind of trade that can take place later in the year. Because I'm of the mindset that you should be patient with your team. That's what I was this week. And I saw the deficiencies that my team had. I saw the strengths that my team had. I saw that I needed to bolster my running back room. And I saw that I might need to switch around some of the ways I think about my quarterbacks as well. And also my wide receivers as well. So week 1 isn't necessarily the best time to truly gauge trades right now. But I could see a world where a lot of trade happens, especially in, say, weeks 3 through 4, that could affect your fantasy football season. That's why I was kind of sitting tight on the Captain Joe King comment, Shep Easy sweet spot, where Mason could potentially be someone to add a lot of leverage in the future. Because overall, it's kind of interesting to be hasty, and it could be something that wins your league. If you take the initiative, then it shows that you're willing to diagnose the league and expand your horizons in terms of who you know and what knowledge you have of certain players. But it also could lead to regrettable situations because who knows if Devontae Adams could be something. You know what I mean? And while that trade at face value could have worked, at this current moment in time, it is definitely feeling like a wait-and-see trade because a 2-for-1 deal is good, but you have to feel absolutely confident that the one player you're receiving can elevate your team at this current week-by-week basis because that's what fantasy is. It's a week-by-week thing. You have to assess certain matchups. You have to assess your team most importantly and assess what value you can get out of a trade, especially this early. So that's why that trade is so interesting. But some candidates for trades, maybe not right in the immediate future, because yet again, I'm someone who wants to wait and see and wait it out and try to get more assets later in the year to make a playoff push. But some trade candidates, trade away if you have him on your roster, and this is something that I will have to get around to doing because he did not perform very well for me, DeAndre Swift. I think that DeAndre Swift, I was kind of hopeful about him when I was talking about Caleb outperforming Stroud in my Bulls fantasy predictions, but he is someone who, at this point in his career, I don't necessarily know if bouncing around to different teams will work out for him. And it's not going to work out for a Bears team that's going through some growing pains. So he's someone who I'm going to trade away. You should, if you have him rostered, trade away as well. But someone you should trade for, who can definitely keep up with the performances, is Ramondre Stevenson. I like him a lot in this New England Patriots offense, and I like that strategic approach that Jerod Mayo employed in their upset win over Cincinnati this week. He definitely adds a lot of value. I think if that's the way they want to go, then Ramondre Stevenson will get a lot of opportunities. He's not going to have a lot of pretty performances. He's kind of one of those ugly running backs who grounds and pounds for yards. But at the end of the day, smash mouth football is what can get Patriots wins. It's what gets Ramondre Stevenson touches as well. So I'm really intrigued to see how Ramondre Stevenson plays out in certain fantasy leagues. And last but not least, a guy who's going to be playing, not directly, but this weekend, Kenneth Walker as well. I think that, Mike McDonald realized at halftime in that game against the Broncos that if Seattle had good field position, which they didn't for most of that first half, then Kenneth Walker was going to be the X factor in this offense. And he proved to be yes. The offensive line concerns for Seattle run deep. I'm really concerned about that unit as a Seattle Seahawks fan. And it's not one that gives me confidence going up against the Patriots front, seeing what they did. But Kenneth Walker is someone who is going to be someone utilized a lot in Seattle's system. He's someone who's going to open up a lot of lanes and avenues for Ryan Grubb in his first year as their OC. So Kenneth Walker is definitely going to be someone that you can look to trade for in the future as Seattle grows into the season. But overall, this is early goings. Trade advice this early can be taken with a grain of salt. A lot of you have been really eager about trades, and that's what I love. But at the end of the day, I'm someone who values patience in fantasy because you don't know week by week what's going to happen in the NFL until it happens. Like Jordan Love going down, Puka going down, things of that nature. So you're going to have to take it week by week. But right now there are some value in trades. And it's going to be about team fit for fantasy purposes, how you see the teams involved in your trades playing out, whether or not you feel like that trade is right for you in terms of what you're getting in return. Because right now, when I look at the Adams and Mason for Rice trade, it could be appealing based off what you saw from all three of those players. But at the end of the day, you still have to consider what the season could look like for each of those respective teams. And so I will accept all the trade analysis. I love breaking down trades. But just know that right now, I personally, even though I'm coming to you from a place of help and I want you to feel like you can get guidance, I feel like right now is not the best time to be hasty in terms of a trade. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for our third segment of today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed this trade advice. I'm really loving all the trade advice that you guys are looking for. I hope that I've been of help for you. But coming next, we switch to our updated rankings. We've seen all the QBs. We've seen all the running backs. Which will be in the top 5. This is not my personal top 5 just yet. I'll talk about my personal top 5 quarterbacks for this week coming next. But these is just an updated QB and running back rankings to close out today's show. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello everyone and welcome to the second to last segment of today's show here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show this far. I know I have. Keep up your interaction. It has been a great part of today's show. But coming up next our fourth segment of today's show, shifting gears from an overarching grab bag of fantasy topics to my final QB ranking. Not my personal final QB rankings, but some comprehensive QB rankings to give you guys before week 2. Now, I will give my own personal rankings coming up later in the week, but these are the guys who certain pundits have assessed and said had the top 5 performances or potentially will have the top 5 performances in week 2. So without further ado, let's jump right into this second segment of today's show. Now, the QBs this weekend were very talented. At the end of the day, I feel like this top 5 is kind of chalk. It's not necessarily an ambitious top 5 in terms of, say, whether or not you're in a deeper league, but these are the top 5 guys. And this is what I expected to wake up to in terms of trying to decipher who different pundits thought the top 5 fantasy QBs were. So without further ado, let's talk about them a little bit more in depth. At number 5, we have, of course, a guy who could kind of a rough game, depending on whether or not you believe that he should have been that involved late in the game, and they should have stuck with the run game like I was talking to and alluding to in my fantasy predictions segment. But Lamar Jackson. Oh wait, is this the right one? Oh, I guess I only had the top 4, but Lamar Jackson was my 5th one. He has 26 for 41 this week, 273 yards, 1 TD, 25.12 points. Before we get into Jared Goff, just wanted to talk about Lamar Jackson a little bit, give him some love. And I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic for Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry in that backfield. I think that out of necessity, they allow Lamar to try and get back into this game by throwing the ball more. But it will change week by week. And against the Raiders this week, I feel like there might be opportunities for Derrick Henry. But at the end of the day, that front is really going to make the difference. Can the Raiders' defensive front keep him in that game? And so Lamar Jackson will have to perform out of structure. It's going to literally be up to him to perform out of structure. And so I really think that Lamar Jackson could have been higher on this list in terms of pundits' minds, but he is going to be someone who is still highly coveted as a top-tier fantasy QB. But as you can see on my screen, prematurely getting ahead of myself here, but number 4 is, in fact, Jared Goff. He had only 11.38 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Rams. Didn't really have a big game. Really allowed the running backs to dictate this game, but I can see why a lot of people are still so high on him. Maybe this is kind of an over-exaggeration from pundits, but he is someone who I still think is believably going to be at least very reliable fantasy QB. He's not going to have the prettiest of numbers. He's not going to be, in that Mahomes, Allen, Hurts, Jackson region, but he's going to be someone who could find himself in weekly top 5s in people's minds. And so I think against the Bucs, it's going to be a divisional game matchup, much like the Rams one was. And so I feel as if this game is going to bring out the best in Jared Goff. I definitely don't think that he will, kind of take a backseat this game. He's going to take the initiative. He wants to get Amon-Ra going. He wants to get Sam Laporta going. He wants to get all those versatile weapons going in this offense. And so look for Jared Goff to have a quote-unquote bounce-back game, even though he wasn't necessarily the worst player. Now, the third one makes a lot of sense, and perhaps he was my top fantasy QB player this week. Josh Allen, 31.18 fantasy points against Arizona, included 232 yards passing on 18 of 25, 2 touchdowns, 39 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground as well. Obviously, kind of nursing that hand/wrist injury, was cleared to play against the Dolphins Thursday night. So excited to see that matchup, but this was a very impressive performance. Yes, he did fumble in that first possession, but he put his head down, and even though they had many struggles in their first half against Arizona, in the second half, he was sterling. He really impressed in this game, and it could have been that he was the number one player in terms of fantasy overall and as a QB because of his do-it-all abilities. I'm kind of shocked that people don't necessarily believe the hype surrounding Josh Allen, but I believe that Josh Allen doesn't get his flowers for what he's done. He's navigated a lot of tense situations in Buffalo, and this year certainly feels like a weight has been lifted off his shoulders. He's a rejuvenated man in an offense that's tailor-made to play to some of his strengths and also kind of hide some of his weaknesses as well. And in this game, as Andre says, agreed. Thank you, Andre, for that comment. Welcome to the show if you are new here. Continue commenting if you so like. But getting back to Josh Allen, I still think this guy is going to be someone that's always, at the end of the day, going to be in the conversation as a top 3, top 1 maybe, fantasy QB as the weeks go by. So I'm not worried about Josh Allen. He deserves to be in these rankings. He's my favorite QB in the league for sure, says Andre. He's definitely in mine. I'm kind of biased about my QB likes because a lot of people might not like my favorite QBs, but he's definitely someone who I've loved for many years because of his dual threat ability, and this year certainly feels like it feels different for him in terms of how he's performing and how he can perform in future weeks. But going to number 2 on this list, Jalen Hurts. Let's talk about his performance. Now, this was a weird game in general. International game. A lot of big plays, but a lot of bad moments for both offenses. And Jalen Hurts wasn't necessarily out of the clear here as well. He had some big plays. A.J. Brown was fantastic. Saquon Barkley had a passing touchdown. Kudos to him for getting involved in the pass game. He was one of the fantasy standouts of the week for me as well. But at the end of the day, Jalen Hurts definitely felt like he left a lot of big plays on the field. I don't know if it's kind of like the international kind of mindset where you're not necessarily in the confines of your home or what have you, but it certainly felt like even though he had a good fantasy performance, he had 16.42 fantasy performances in this game, I still think that he could have a lot to be desired. And this offense could look a lot of different ways week by week. I think that Kellen Moore is just learning the strengths and weaknesses of what this offense can do. Obviously, the retirement of Jason Kelce is a big thing. I think that Cam Jurgens held up admirably in certain situations. But this is an offense that I still feel is going to have growing pains as Kellen Moore tries to implement new ideas into it. And Jalen Hurts, I still think is going to be in the top 5. As Andre says, what do you think the red zone split percentage will be with Hurts and Saquon? Another fantastic question. Or do you think they just continue to feed Saquon in the red zone? We got a very similar question, Andre, a couple weeks ago about how they will utilize Hurts and Saquon in the running game. In terms of answering this particular question, I think that Saquon just adds a lot of value anywhere on the field. I think that he will take a lot of pressure off of Jalen Hurts in terms of, Jalen Hurts just running to create opportunities down the field. But at the end of the day, in the red zone, I still think Jalen Hurts has a lot of value because there will be a lot of opportunities for the tush push to happen. And Saquon doesn't necessarily profile into that picture. But in this game, Saquon did have a lot of red zone touches. So it's something to monitor. I think that a lot of it will come down to how drives work out and pan out in the future for the Eagles. I think that Saquon can make a lot of plays happen in the open field in terms of explosiveness, and Hurts just makes kind of calculated plays in terms of what he sees down the field. So that being said, I think it will come down to how drives pan out, because sometimes they have those weird drives where they'll end up at the 1 yard line and the tush push is the way to go, or sometimes they'll have drives where they might need Hurts to improvise a little bit more. So it's going to be an interesting situation, but fascinating question. Thank you for it, Andre, and thank you for your comments throughout the show. But like I said, Jalen Hurts is going to be a quarterback who's going to be in these rankings very often. But he's someone who's going to have to prove week in, week out that he can lure Kellen Moore's offense to the best effect and have it pay dividends on the field. As Andre says, I hope this will utilize the tush push at the goal line. Hurt is my QB in fantasy. Need that. Always looking for different ways to elevate your fantasy points. Love it. I think that the tush push will still be a big part of this offense. It's not going anywhere. Thank you for your comments, Andre. Fantastic comments, as always. Keep them coming if you so wish. But our final QB on this list, always going to be here and hereabouts, Patrick Mahomes. It wasn't his best game. Only 15.14 fantasy points against Baltimore. I think that this is just indicative of who Patrick Mahomes is. This is nothing to do with, the weapons he has, but the way Patrick Mahomes can and will utilize these weapons. Because we saw, it was a very mundane game from him. He had the pass to Xavier Worthy. He had a couple good passes. He utilized Rashee Rice very well. But you could say a lot of QBs performed quote-unquote better than him, especially in fantasy purposes. Like I said, though, week by week, Patrick Mahomes, as this wide receiver room gets more depth to it, as this wide receiver room gets Hollywood Brown incorporated into it, it's going to continue to be dangerous. And the Bengals are going to be no different, especially how they looked. Consider his stats against the Bengals as well. 112.5 passer rating, 1,085 yards, 8 touchdowns, only 1 interception in his career against the Bengals. Doesn't have the best of records, only 500 against them. But it just goes to show that Patrick Mahomes doesn't necessarily fear certain situations. As funny as it was to say with the frustrations that he seemed to have last year with the drops from his wide receivers, this year the whole narrative seems to be shifting. And a lot of people, might not, quote unquote, like Mahomes in real life or in fantasy because they just feel like there's so much depth at the QB position now and want to go a different route. But Patrick Mahomes is always someone who's going to be on this list. Like it or not. Make of it what you will. And I really think that what impresses me about the Chiefs is that no matter who they rotate in and out, Patrick Mahomes will always find a way to make a big play. One of my favorite plays was not, one of my passes to one of the guys expected. It was a pass to Justin Watson because it just goes to show that you have to account for so many different receivers and weapons in the system that you can leave a guy open in the middle of the field. And that's what the Chiefs can do. That's what Patrick Mahomes can do. Let me know what you think about this list in the comments. Again, this is not my list, but it is pretty comprehensive, and it's basically chalk from this week. These are 5 guys, maybe excluding Jared Goff, you expect to be here and hereabouts almost every given week in terms of who releases what. My personal top 5 will be coming later in the week, more so in terms of matchups instead of, overall QB rankings. But that will just about do it for this segment. Thank you for the comments during it. But our last segment of the day will be looking at the running backs in terms of their rankings and what pundits think of them. We'll be right back to finish the show after this quick break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, where we'll see us shift gears from the QBs to the running backs. And I loved a lot of the running back performances. Again, this top 5 list is not necessarily my own, but it is one that I feel like encompasses the week, encompasses the narrative surrounding running backs, and most importantly encompasses who the best running backs are projected to be. I think that this top 5 definitely has its faults, it has its flaws, but week by week, this top 5 is the most likely to change out of any position group, and there are definitely going to be guys who I really like according to matchup rather than, just overall abilities. And also, injuries will play a role in the running backs. There are some guys who are injury prone in this list, and so don't take this list as gospel, because I never like truly taking pundits' lists as gospel. They're always fun when they're released, but this is just my analysis of what the pundits will say, and then I want to give my personal spin on it, because I still think fantasy is all about matchups, and sometimes it's not just all about, I think this player is the best, so he will always help me win. That being said, let's get into the top 5 according to pundits in terms of running back rankings and my personal analysis of them. Coming in number 5 is a guy who I'm still expecting big things out of. Has an opportunity this week to have a big game. I think he could. I think he will be a huge asset to this offense going forward, especially as Anthony Richardson really tries to develop as a true pro-ready quarterback, and that is Jonathan Taylor. Now, against the Texans, didn't really have much going for him. He only had 16.8 fantasy points, 16 carries, 48 yards, 1 touchdown. And it is kind of disappointing for someone who was expected to be a leader in this offense to have that kind of output. But at the end of the day, Jonathan Taylor just feels like a guy who, will eventually get to the point where he's a huge help to Anthony Richardson. Right now, this was Richardson's first game back. They're kind of unfamiliar with each other, to be honest with you, Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor. So maybe Anthony Richardson wanted to kind of show what he can do as a vertical threat, and he definitely showed it on some throws in this game. But at the end of the day, Jonathan Taylor will get his opportunities. This stat line is not indicative of what I think Jonathan Taylor is. He's certainly a guy who actually, in my opinion, still gets underrated a little bit in fantasy, just because a lot of people expect the most out of him and he doesn't necessarily produce, and so they kind of say good riddance to him. But he's someone who I still think is going to be a guy to look out for. And against Green Bay, against a defense that has a lot of questions about their run defense after what Saquon did to them in Brazil, I think that Jonathan Taylor will have more opportunities. And I think that they're going to exploit that and definitely try and open up things for Anthony Richardson. So look for a very balanced game plan for the Colts, and especially for Jonathan Taylor as well. But coming in at number 4, this one is one I don't necessarily agree with. And I don't expect to see this guy in the top 5 many more times. Now, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think about this guy in the comments. Derrick Henry. Like I said, I gave him the benefit of the doubt on that opening drive. That opening drive was very impressive. They ran in the field. They punched it in with him. And it really showed that he can be an aggressive chunk play kind of back in the system. With that being said, 13 carries for 46 yards, yes. The game flow suggested that Lamar throw the ball more often to try and keep pace with the Chiefs. But at the end of the day, I still don't see the fit if this were just a normal pedestrian humdrum game for the Baltimore Ravens, where Derrick Henry fits into this offense. I think that Justice Hill truly speaks to what Baltimore Ravens running backs are, in that they're more committee approached. They just add to the explosiveness of what the rushing attack for Baltimore is, combined with Lamar's abilities to rush. So I feel like Justice Hill just gives this offense a better profile. It definitely looked better in terms of distribution. And most importantly, behind that offensive line, maybe it could make sense for a more smash mouth style. But at the end of the day, I still think that the screen game could also work for this offensive line in the future, because the offensive line was very disappointing, and they definitely need to step up for any of this to happen. But Derrick Henry, I still don't see it. I won't see it until he proves me wrong. Let's just say that. But against Las Vegas, who knows? Maybe you're going to need that physicality and grit because the Raiders will try to drag you into their game. And you might just need a guy like Derrick Henry to kind of bring that physicality to your offense. And so, who knows? Maybe this will be justified in the future. But coming in at number 3, another guy who kind of had an underwhelming performance, but I expect more out of as this team improves. Again, this is week 1, and a lot of new teams and new faces and new places are getting their ideas implemented, so it's not going to be pretty. And it wasn't pretty necessarily for Breece Hall. He did have a touchdown this game, 16 carries, 54 yards, 18.3 fantasy points. But it wasn't necessarily, by his lofty standards, a game where he will look back upon and say that he performed well. I mean, this is more an indictment of how the running game, the offensive line played in the running game versus the passing game. Because I was shocked in the passing game they held up so well against that 49ers defensive front. In the run game, it was kind of a different story. And so, I need to see this offensive line improve. This is not an indictment of Breece Hall by any means, because he will find ways to get yards. He will find ways to make explosive plays for this offense. But it's kind of a concern. Against the Titans, it should be a bit easier. Maybe Tavondre Sweat will be a big X factor in trying to stop the run. He will definitely have a say in this game, in my opinion. Hook 'em horns. But, had to throw that in there. But at the end of the day, Breece Hall is just a guy who you expect to be there and thereabouts. And week by week, as this Jets offense gets more comfortable, as the offensive line, obviously with 3 new additions to it, gets more comfortable, then you can start to see this team improve week by week, and Breece Hall get more touches, and more touches where he's allowed to make explosive plays down the field. Coming in number 2, Christian McCaffrey. Let's talk about this situation. I still don't know what's wrong. I still don't know if he will play this weekend or how long he could be out. Nobody knows. It's definitely up in the air. That's why I said earlier in the show about Jordan Mason, keep him. Keep him and use him as leverage so that when, Christian McCaffrey comes back, you can fleece someone. But Christian McCaffrey, once he comes back, he's one of the biggest X factors for this team. And if what Kyle Shanahan did last night translates to the rest of the season, then expect Christian McCaffrey to put up big numbers in this offense. And even if he doesn't necessarily stick with that game plan, maybe he just wanted to use an element of surprise against the Jets. Even if he doesn't implement this game plan, Christian McCaffrey will still have big plays in this offense. 21 touchdowns in this offense last year. Most yards from scrimmage last year as well. So Christian McCaffrey, when he's healthy, is either a 2 or 1. But number 1 this week, and I'm not mad at this ranking, has to go to Saquon Barkley. For what he did internationally in Brazil with his new team, perfect fit for this offense. Unlike Derrick Henry, I see this as a perfect fit. It alleviates the burden on Jalen Hurts. We saw it a little bit in this game. Still a little bit of chinks in the armor there, but Saquon definitely adds a versatility to the Philadelphia Eagles. And once they figure it out, look out for them as a threat. Because Saquon, he also has his injury history, but when he's healthy, he can pay dividends in any offense in the NFL. That's how explosive he is. That will just about do it for the show. Let me know what you think in the comments. But that will just about do it for, like I said, for this segment. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Continue using the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Feature stickers to interact with the show as we are now live. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. I am out. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern for yet another edition. Thank you all.